The Dark History of Haunted Asylum. Chapter 1. Introduction. My name is Mara Voss, and until last October, I made my living photographing places nobody wanted to remember. Abandoned mills, burned-out churches, the kind of buildings that show up on real estate listings marked as is because nobody's brave enough to write anything else. I'd built a modest online following doing this. Nothing viral, just enough that a production company reached out about a documentary series on decommissioned mental institutions. They wanted someone who could handle a camera and wasn't going to scream and drop it at the first creaking door. I told them I'd done haunted houses before. I hadn't done Blackthorn Ridge. It sat about 40 minutes outside of Coldwater, Ohio, at the end of a gravel road so overgrown the production van's tires kept catching on roots. The asylum had been closed since 1987. Before that, it operated for almost 80 years, and depending on which version of local history you believed, somewhere between 300 and 1,100 patients had died within its walls. Nobody agreed on the number, because, as our historical consultant Ben put it, record-keeping wasn't exactly a priority for places like this. I remember standing at the edge of the property that first afternoon, sun still up, birds still making noise in the tree line, and feeling something I couldn't name. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of being looked at from a window when you know the building's empty. "You good?" Ben asked. He was younger than me, eager, the kind of guy who'd read every book on the subject and none of the actual experience. "Fine," I said, just getting a read on the place. That was a lie. What I was actually doing was ignoring the way the hair on my arms had lifted, the way my stomach had gone tight and low, the way some old animal part of my brain was quietly screaming, "Don't." I didn't listen. That's the thing about warnings. You only recognize them clearly once it's too late to use them. The crew was small. Me, Ben, our sound guy Priya, and a producer named Doug, who mostly stayed in the van drinking gas station coffee and reviewing insurance paperwork. We had 3 weeks of permitted access, funded by some cable network eager for authentic content, whatever that meant when the building itself had been gutted, graffitied, and picked over by decades of trespassers. The main structure rose up in that particular institutional Gothic style. Red brick, gone the color of dried blood, windows in rows like teeth. A bell tower that had lost its bell sometime in the 90s. Inside, the air had a taste to it. Wet plaster, mildew, something underneath that I couldn't place until Priya said it first. "Smells like a hospital," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Like antiseptic. Almost. That's not possible after this long, right?" Ben shrugged. "Sometimes chemical residue lingers in the walls. Formaldehyde, cleaning agents. Could be that." It didn't smell like chemical residue. It smelled fresh, the way a hospital smells the day after they've mopped, and no amount of explaining it away made that easier to sit with. We set up our first equipment in the main administrative wing, cameras aimed down long hallways where paint peeled off the walls in curling strips, like the building itself was shedding skin. I took my usual photographs, wide shots of empty wards, close-ups of rusted bed frames still bolted to the floor, a child's shoe someone had left on a windowsill that made my chest hurt to look at. By the time the sun went down, something had shifted in the group. We were laughing less, talking quieter. I caught Priya glancing over her shoulder twice while checking her audio levels, And when I asked her about it, she just said, "Feels like it's busy in here. You know, like we're not the only ones working." I told her she was tired. I told myself the same thing. That first night, back at the motel in Coldwater, I lay awake a long time, listening to the hum of the ice machine down the hall, and I kept thinking about that shoe on the windowsill, small, scuffed at the toe, placed there deliberately, like someone meant to come back for it. I didn't know yet how right that feeling was. Chapter 2. Strange events. The trouble started small, the way it always does. So small you can talk yourself past it 3, 4, 5 times before you stop being able to. On our second day, Ben's audio recorder picked up something during a silent take in Ward C, a long, low groan of static that resolved when he slowed it down later into what might have been a word. He played it for us in the van, headphones passed hand to hand. "Tell me that's not help," Priya said. "Could be wind through the pipes," Ben said, though his face had gone pale in a way that undercut the reassurance. I listened to it twice and didn't say anything, because what I heard wasn't help. What I heard was a woman's voice, close to the microphone, saying, "You shouldn't be here." I kept that to myself. I told myself I'd misheard it. That suggestion does strange things to the ear, that 3 people huddled in a dark asylum listening for ghosts will hear ghosts whether they're there or not. That's what I told myself. It didn't stop me checking the recorder for my own name. Small things followed, day after day, each one explainable on its own, and unsettling in accumulation. Doors that Doug swore he'd locked stood open in the morning. A rocking chair in what had been the female patient's day room, one we'd photographed motionless a dozen times, appeared in one frame with a faint blur along its arc, as though it had just stopped moving before the shutter closed. "Air current," Ben said. "Old buildings settle." I started sleeping badly. Not from fear exactly, more from a persistent sense of being unfinished with something, the way you feel when you've left the stove on and can't remember checking it. I'd wake at 3 in the morning in my motel room, with my heart going hard, certain I'd heard my name spoken clearly, right beside my ear, and find the room empty and silent every time. On the 4th day, I went back through my photographs and found the girl. She was in 6 of them. Not obviously. You had to know where to look, the way you have to know where to look at one of those hidden image puzzles before your eyes catch it, and then can't unsee it. A shape at the end of a hallway, a pale smear behind a broken window on the 2nd floor, in a wing we hadn't yet entered because the floor joists were rated unsafe. A shadow at the corner of the frame in the day room, roughly the height and build of a child, standing where no child should have been standing, in a building that had been empty and padlocked for over 3 decades. I showed Priya. She went very quiet, scrolling through the images twice. "Mara," she said finally, "I need you to tell me you didn't do this in editing. I didn't touch these. They're straight off the card." She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to believe me, and then she said something that stuck with me ever since. My grandmother used to say that some places remember you before you've even walked in, like they've been waiting. She handed the camera back. "I don't like this place remembering us, Mara." Neither did I. But we had a contract, and Doug wasn't the type to let a good ratings hook go, because his crew got spooked by static and blurry photos. So we kept working, kept filming, kept telling each other it was atmosphere, was expectation, was our own minds doing what minds do in the dark. Then, on the 6th night, Ben didn't come back to the van. Chapter 3. Darkness Grows. We'd split up to cover more ground, against my better judgment. But Doug wanted footage from 3 angles simultaneously for the reveal segment. And arguing with Doug about safety protocol was like arguing with a brick wall that also owed money to a network. Ben had gone up to the 2nd floor, the unsafe wing, against explicit instructions, because he'd heard something on his headset he wanted to chase down. Priya and I were on the ground floor when his radio went dead mid-sentence. Not static, not a garbled signal. Just silence cut clean, like someone had reached out and switched him off. "Ben," Priya said into her radio. Nothing. We found him 40 minutes later, sitting on the floor of what had once been a padded isolation cell, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. His flashlight lay a few feet away, still on, casting long shadows up the walls. When I said his name, he didn't respond. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched so hard he cracked his head against the wall behind him. "There was a woman," he said. Once we'd gotten him back downstairs and wrapped in Doug's spare jacket, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his own coffee cup. She was standing in the doorway. She didn't walk in. She was just there, and she kept saying the same thing over and over. "What did she say?" I asked, though some part of me didn't want the answer. "They took my baby." Ben's eyes were wet, unfocused, over and over. "They took my baby. They took my baby." And then she smiled at me, Mara, and her mouth kept going. It kept smiling past where a mouth should stop. Doug wanted to write it off as exhaustion, dehydration, a panic attack in a spooky building. Reasonable things, human things. I wanted to believe him. But that night, I finally did what I should have done on day 1. I went looking into Blackthorn Ridge's actual history, not the sanitized tourist pamphlet version, but old newspaper archives, county records, anything Ben's research had skimmed over in favor of ghost stories. What I found didn't come with the neat, satisfying shape of a haunted house documentary. It came in fragments, the way real history usually does. A 1961 county health inspection citing severe overcrowding and unsanitary conditions in the maternity annex. A 1958 obituary notice for an unnamed infant of the institution. A court case, later dismissed, alleging that patients at Blackthorn had been subjected to unauthorized medical procedures without consent. There had been a maternity annex. I hadn't even known that. A wing where women, patients, inmates, whatever term the era preferred, had been kept when they were pregnant, sometimes by husbands who'd had them committed to be rid of them, sometimes by staff. A detail the old newspapers referenced only in careful, lawyer-approved language. I found the wing on our building schematics. It was the 2nd floor, the unsafe wing, the one Ben had been in. I didn't sleep at all that night. Chapter 4. Terror We Should Have Left. I know that now with the kind of clarity that only comes after the fact. The way you always know exactly what you should have done once it's too late to do it. Instead, Doug, rattled but still thinking about his ratings, decided we'd film one final sequence in the maternity annex to close out the historical arc, and then pack up early. Ben refused to go back up. I didn't blame him. Priya and I went instead, cameras rolling, flashlights cutting thin cones through decades of dust. The annex smelled different from the rest of the building. Sweeter, wrong. Underneath the mildew and rot, there was something that reminded me, sickeningly, of a hospital nursery. The smell of powder and warm skin layered over decay. like two different rooms had been folded into one and left to rot together. We found the first crib in a room at the end of the hall. Rusted metal frame, the mattress long gone to mildewed springs, and a mobile still hanging above it, somehow, impossibly still turning in air that had no draft to move it. "Mara," Priya whispered. "Mara, I want to leave. 2 more minutes," I said, because I am, at heart, the kind of fool who keeps a camera rolling right up until the moment it kills her. That's when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, all at once, a wall of cold that hit so hard I saw my breath fog in front of me and heard Priya gasp beside me. The mobile stopped turning. The silence that followed had weight to it. Pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm. And then, from somewhere down the hall, behind us, a baby began to cry. It wasn't distant, it wasn't muffled by walls or distance the way a real cry would be. It was close, too close, right at my shoulder, and it kept going even as I spun around and found nothing but empty hallway and Priya's flashlight beam shaking across bare floorboards. "That's not possible," Priya said, her voice cracking. "That's not, Mara. There's nothing there. Where's that coming from?" The crying stopped mid-breath, cut off exactly the way Ben's radio had cut off. And in the silence that replaced it, I heard, very clearly, very close to my ear, a woman's voice. "You have to help me find her." I turned. There was no one there, but the cold air moved past me like someone walking through it, and every hair on my body stood on end. And somewhere down the hallway, a door slammed so hard, the sound rolled through the whole wing like a gunshot. We ran. I'm not ashamed to say it. We ran the length of that hallway, and down the stairs, and out into the parking lot, and we didn't stop until we hit the van, and Doug was already outside, staring up at the building with an expression I'd never seen on him before. The look of a man whose skepticism had just failed him completely. "Second floor," he said. "Horse. East window. Third from the left." I looked where he was pointing. In the window, lit from within by no light source any of us could explain, stood a woman in a pale hospital gown. Her face turned toward us, unmoving, and in her arms, she was holding something small and still. Chapter 5. The truth. We didn't sleep that night either. None of us did. Not really. We just sat in Doug's motel room with every light on and the television playing static-free channels for the noise of it. And around 2 in the morning, I finally told them what I'd learned about the maternity annex. "There's more," I said, because I hadn't told them the worst part yet. "I found a name. Eleanor Voss." Priya frowned. "Voss? That's my great-aunt," I said. "I didn't know until I dug into the county archive. My grandfather's sister. She was committed to Blackthorn Ridge in 1959. Family always said she'd had a nervous breakdown after her husband left her. Nobody ever mentioned she'd been pregnant." Doug's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. I'd spent that afternoon on the phone with a records clerk in Coldwater, a patient woman named Carol, who dug through boxes in a county basement while I paced a motel parking lot, and what she found matched the newspaper fragments almost exactly. Eleanor Voss had given birth at Blackthorn Ridge in the spring of 1960. The infant, a girl, was recorded as having died shortly after delivery. Cause, complications, no further detail, no burial record on file. Eleanor herself died at the institution 11 months later. Cause of death listed simply as heart failure, which back then was doctor speak for whatever they didn't feel like explaining. But Carol told me something the records didn't. Her own grandmother had worked as a laundress at Blackthorn in those years, And family stories passed down said the maternity annex wasn't what it claimed to be. Infants born there to unmarried patients, or patients whose families had paid extra for discretion, were sometimes never handed over to their mothers at all. Sometimes they were quietly given to other families for a fee, off the books, no paperwork, no questions. And sometimes, when a mother wouldn't stop asking, wouldn't stop screaming, wouldn't stop trying to leave, she simply stopped being a problem the institution had to manage. They killed her, I said, and my voice didn't sound like mine when I said it. They killed my great-aunt because she wouldn't let it go, because she kept asking where her baby was. Priya reached over and took my hand. Nobody said anything for a long moment. That's why she's still there, Priya said finally. Quiet. She's still looking. She's been looking for 60 years. I thought about the woman in the window, the shape holding something small and still, the voice at my shoulder saying you have to help me find her, and I understood with a horror that went deeper than any static recording or blurry photograph that Eleanor Voss hadn't been asking Priya or Ben or Doug for help. She'd been asking me, family, blood, the only person left alive who might actually care enough to answer. Chapter 6, Final Nightmare. The first went back alone the next night. I know how that sounds. I know every rule of every horror story says the fool who goes back alone deserves whatever she gets. And maybe I did. But there are some doors, once you've seen what's behind them, that you cannot simply close and drive away from. Eleanor Voss was my blood. Whatever she'd become, whatever Blackthorn Ridge had made of her after 60 years of grief curdling in the dark, she deserved someone who'd at least try to listen. The others didn't know I'd gone. I left before dawn, drove the gravel road with my headlights off so the crew wouldn't wake and follow, and let myself in through the same broken side door we'd used all week. The building was different at that hour, not louder, quieter, if anything, but it was the quiet of something holding its breath. I walked the ground floor, calling her name into the dark, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure, until the cold hit me again. That same wall of temperature drop, and I knew she was close. Eleanor, I said, my name is Mara. I'm Robert's granddaughter, your family. I know what happened to you here. I know what they did. The air moved. Somewhere above me, footsteps crossed a floor that should have held no weight. I climbed the stairs to the maternity annex, with my flashlight shaking in my hand, and I found her in the same room as before, standing beside the rusted crib. And this time, I didn't run. This time I made myself look. She was young, younger than I'd expected, younger than the photograph Carol had emailed me of a stern, unsmiling woman in a 1950s church dress. Her hospital gown hung loose on a frame gone thin with decades of longing, and her face, when she turned it toward me, held an expression I recognized immediately because I'd worn it myself at my own mother's funeral. The specific, bottomless grief of someone who has lost the one thing that made the rest of it bearable. They told me she died, Eleanor said, and her voice was the voice from the recording, close and clear and heartbreakingly human. But I heard her cry. I heard her cry after they took her away, Mara. I've always heard her. I know, I said, and my own voice broke. I believe you. Help me find her. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Some resolution, maybe. A body finally located. A grave finally marked. The particular piece that true crime documentaries promise their audiences right before the credits roll. That's not what happened. What happened was that Eleanor turned toward the crib and reached into it and lifted something that had not been there a moment before. Small, wrapped in a yellowed blanket, utterly still, and held it against her chest the way a mother holds a child she has finally stopped losing. "There she is," Eleanor whispered, and she was smiling now. The same smile Ben had described, stretching further than a mouth should stretch. Joy and horror occupying the exact same space on her face. "There's my girl." The temperature in the room dropped so fast my breath turned to ice in my throat. The flashlight died in my hand, and in the absolute dark that followed, I heard Eleanor's voice change. No longer grieving, no longer pleading, but flat and final. The voice of someone whose long search had just ended and who no longer had any reason to let me leave. "You found her for me," she said, right beside my ear, close enough that I felt breath that shouldn't exist. "Now you can stay and meet her too." I don't remember leaving the building. I don't remember the drive back to the motel, or Priya finding me at dawn slumped against my car door, or the 3 days I spent afterward unable to speak above a whisper. What I remember is waking up, weeks later, back home, safe, certain it was finally over. That was 6 months ago. Last night, my daughter's baby monitor picked up crying from an empty nursery 2 rooms away. A nursery we haven't finished painting yet. A nursery that, as of this writing, holds no crib at all. I haven't told anyone. I keep telling myself it's the old pipes settling, wind through a window I haven't sealed properly, my own exhausted mind playing tricks after everything that happened at Blackthorn Ridge. But 3 nights ago, I found a child's shoe on my windowsill. Small, scuffed at the toe. I never brought it home with me. I checked.